All right, good evening everybody, welcome back again. Thanks so much for joining once again. It nearly didn't happen tonight. I only got back from a weekend away about 45 minutes ago. Had a lovely weekend, very relaxing, barely picked up my phone, didn't do any work, which was amazing, but also means I'm slightly underprepared for tonight, but maybe you'll think that's normal. We always get away with it, so we'll be fine. I also picked up a bit of a suntan, which not sure quite how that's going to go down from a continuity perspective when I get back to filming this week for Wheeler Dealers. So at some point in the future, you'll be watching an episode of Wheeler Dealers. We'll go to an ad break. We'll come back from that ad break and I'll have changed colour. So keep an eye out for that one later this year. Anyway, had a lovely weekend, but now we're back into it. We're back all about F1 again for me, building up to the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. I know that you guys will be the same. I'm sure many of you spent your weekend still heavily motorsport based, whether it was Extreme E, whether it was the Indy 500. I haven't seen it yet, but I definitely will. But if you want to talk about it, we'll go there. And I don't really know what else to talk about tonight. It's going to be over to you. So I want you to lead tonight. I'm just going to be the conduit to guide us through whatever the talking points you lot want to talk about. So we'll pick that up in a moment. First of all, thank you again to everybody. Hello from all over the world as ever. People tuning in from Hong Kong, Florida, Sheffield in the UK, where in the UK, it has been like summer finally arrived this weekend, which has been amazing. Victoria in British Columbia in Canada, from where else? From Scotland, from Utah in the US and Virginia, literally everywhere. So thank you very much again for tuning in. I really appreciate your company. Let's talk about motor racing and Formula One for the next hour. So where do you want to start? Varun Sambi. Hello Varun, always early in the chat. He says, Indy 500 or Flexi-Wings? Well, I dropped Flexi-Wings into the title, not because I wanted to really desperately talk about it, but because it has been a talking point over the course of this week, hasn't it? With talk of protest and counter-protest. Now, we discussed it massively in previous shows about what it is, why it's happening, how it's happening, what the potential argument is against it and whether we should think it should be allowed. I thought I'd bring it up briefly this week and you can take it from here, but we're coming into Baku, and the reason this has become an even bigger talking point than it was is that Baku, of course, has this incredibly long straight, the longest straight on the Formula One calendar that goes up past the pit straight, which is certainly the longest period of flat out full throttle racing. And that, of course, is where you need top speed. And, you know, in this big battle between Mercedes and Red Bull, when it comes to top speed, it's always been Mercedes that have had the clear advantage on that. I'm not saying that's necessarily going to change this weekend, but Red Bull have this rear wing, which is able to dump some of its drag under the higher speeds, under the higher loads the wing sees. When you dump the drag, you increase that top speed before it then returns for the corners under braking where you need the downforce and you can take the drag. So that's the reason for it, and that's why it's such an advantage coming into the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, because the higher top speed that you could potentially achieve with a flexible rear wing along that long straight could be significant. Mercedes, without this, and I don't know how significant it's going to be until we get there, of course, nor does anybody, but without this, you would say that Mercedes, despite being slower than Red Bull in the slower parts of this circuit, which let's not forget is a street track, they've just come off Monaco where Red Bull had a distinct advantage. There are sections of the Azerbaijan track which are very Monaco-esque. The bit that goes up through the city is very tight and twisty, it's narrow, it's all about downforce, it's about mechanical grip, it's about riding lumps and bumps, something Red Bull's been very, very good at. And yet this long straight is all about the top speed. And you can make up so much ground as well as overtake with that increased top speed, something Mercedes have always been really strong at, and therefore Mercedes are now concerned that Red Bull might gain so much from this little device on the back of their car that actually the Azerbaijan Grand Prix may even swing back towards Red Bull. Who knows if that's going to happen or not, but that's why it's become a major talking point. Mercedes wanting to get it banned before the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, even talking about putting in a protest to that end during the course of the weekend. Whether or not that happens, I don't know. But if it did happen, I'm fairly sure there'd be counter-protests from Red Bull, potentially others, around the flexible front wing that Mercedes clearly has. That's not been quite the talking point that others have so far. So that's the story. That's why it's brought up. Let's talk about it. Well, iQuantum says, who do you expect to be stronger in Baku, Mercedes or Red Bull? And that's it. That's the big unknown. I would have always said Mercedes, just because you can't overtake through those tight, twisty bits on the street track where potentially Red Bull are stronger. So even if it comes down to lap time, whether Red Bull might be stronger in outright lap time, who knows? But when it comes to the race, all the overtaking is going to be done along that long straight. And that is where you need top speed. Normally something that Mercedes have been strongest at. Mercedes needs to stop being a crybaby. They were allowed their DAS system. If they found a loophole, tough luck for Marc, says Erwin Mulder. So let's talk about that. Is it fair? I mean, we've covered the idea of whether or not it should be allowed or banned for next year. It's not the same as DAS. That's the first thing that I would say. The DAS was a system that Mercedes invented and went directly to the FIA to say, look, this is what we've come up with. Is it going to be allowed? Can we run it on the car? The FIA said, yep, we've seen all your designs. We're happy that that's going to be okay. That fits within the regulations. But just to let you know, from the following year, we are going to ban it. That's how Mercedes were able to run it. This is slightly different. This is Red Bull finding a way to circumnavigate the test that is the load test for the rear wing. So it's not that Red Bull have gone to the FIA and said, look, we've got a rear wing that's going to flex this much. Is that allowed? Because the FIA would have definitely said no. It's just that the current testing procedure that the FIA use within that framework, the Red Bull rear wing is totally legal. It's just that it goes against the context that the rules are set in that no rear wing or no aerodynamic device should be able to flex to that amount, that much, to give an advantage. That's where the whole muddy and murky area of this comes in. It passes the tests, but it doesn't really strictly adhere to the spirit of the rules. So it's definitely not the same as DAS. I can't see how Marc can protest Red Bull wings at Baku if they're legal by the rule. Well, this is the big thing. And I actually think that if they were to protest the rear wings, I'm not sure they'd get anywhere, because that would almost be, in turn, criticising the FIA's own testing regime. It would almost be saying your tests are not good enough. And I just can't see how that would play out. They've already announced they're bringing in stricter testing rules from the French Grand Prix onwards, which in theory will outlaw the current Red Bull rear wing. I just can't see a protest in Baku gaining traction. But as ever, it would be down to the stewards, not necessarily the FIA or the teams, to have any say in that. The stewards would rule on it if indeed a protest was raised. The FIA should stop hindering innovation. There is not a risk to safety, says Dawson Santagato. And that I kind of agree with. This is something that is not necessarily being banned or restricted just for safety grounds. Of course, the idea of movable aerodynamics comes with certain risks. If a ring or a structure is able to deflect only at the very highest loads, there's a very fine balance between that being able to pass the static load test, then have this area where it can flex at the highest loads and yet not flex so much that it breaks. But look, these are Formula One teams. This is exactly what Formula One teams do. It's no different than trying to stop a car from 200 miles an hour. That's dangerous. When you hit the brakes, there are all sorts of forces going through the braking system, the suspension, the car in itself, the driver. And yet if they get it wrong, the consequences could be so dangerous. And there are many other examples like that on a Formula One car. Anything at 200 miles an hour comes with an inherent danger. This is not necessarily about danger, because the Formula One teams are clever enough to be able to engineer a system like this and be safe. It's much more about preventing teams going down the route of investing huge amounts of money, and it will be huge amounts of money for very detailed and complex research and development processes to understand how to get this very specific carbon fibre layup in the rear wing to get the flexibility at the right zone of use that you need without straying either side of that zone. That's what it's about. My argument against that is we're now in a cost cap. We're now in a cost capped environment, so why not let the teams choose where they want to spend their money? And if it's on a brilliant innovation like a flexible rear wing that still operates within the framework of the rules or the testing regime around those rules, then why not? Like DAS, if a team wants to invest money in DAS, why not? They'll have to peg money back from some other area of their operation, but that can surely be up to them. That's my opinion. on that. Aidan Curtis says, do you expect to see similar changes to the front wings? Well, at the moment, front wings have been much less of a talking point. I think this is all raised, of course, wasn't it, when Mercedes put Lewis Hamilton on the pedestal and presumably asked him to raise this in a press conference because the Mercedes engineers were aware that Red Bull's wing flexed much more than theirs did. It's not a new phenomenon. Teams have been working on this. All teams have been working on this for years and years and years in different levels. But this has become a big talking point because Lewis Hamilton brought it up, and then everyone starts to look a bit more closely. Front wings are a much more flimsy feature. The front wing doesn't produce anywhere near the downforce loading that the rear wing does, and therefore it's a much more flexible structure anyway. The load tests are very different, and I imagine that every single front wing up and down the grid will flex at speed to varying levels. It may become an even bigger talking point if there's a protest that goes in around the rear wing, and depending how that goes, I can see focus being deflected back towards Mercedes and their front wing, which does seem to deflect quite a lot, but we'll have to wait and see on that one. Let me see. Hit the DRS on the like button, says John Norris. Thank you. Yeah, hit that like button. Go and do it now. Thank you. What do you think the cars would look like with less aero rules? Well, that's a really interesting one. I've always thought about trying to look into this, but it's such a huge and complex task that it's going to take a huge amount of work to sort of really decipher it. If you relax the rules around, say, aero, the first thing that I'm pretty sure would happen would be the idea of active or movable aerodynamic devices would definitely become a thing. There is lap time to be gained in aero structures on the car that can move. And I'm not just talking about the flexible solutions that Red Bull and others have on their car now. I'm talking about literally active, hydraulically controlled, active aero parts. A bit like DRS, but on a much grander scale all around the car. There's huge lap time to be had in that, and I'd love to see it because it could be something. I mean, we're already seeing those kind of devices on the very highest end hypercars and supercars around the world today. In fact, even much lower down the scale than that. It's almost commonplace on cars with rear wings that they are now active. So why not let F1 engineers really go wild with that technology? So I'd love to see it. What a car would look like, it's impossible to say at this point because it depends how much you open the rules, but it is an area that I'd love to see explored more. Other teams have flexi-wings. Yeah, lots of teams have. In fact, every team has a flexi-wing. Let's make no mistake about that. You can't have a rear wing or any part of the bodywork that sees an aero load to be infinitely inflexible. It has to flex, otherwise it will break. It's just a case of how much. And it's just that the Red Bull have found a way to cleverly do that above the loading that the static load test in the pit lane places upon them for the Galaxy test. Are Haas researching an anti-spin device? Yeah. Right, active aero sounds awesome. Innovation like that speaks to the imagination, unlike an engine that doesn't make noise, says Redmond Barry. Exactly right, exactly my point. Many of the innovations that we do see on a Formula One car, well, in fact, we don't see them for that very reason. They're hidden. Things like engine technology, which, by the way, in Formula One right now is mind-blowingly advanced. I'm sure you all know the stats by now, but Formula One's been pretty bad at communicating that. And of course, it's not something we can see. Today, we can barely even hear it like we used to in the past because the noise has almost, gone to the levels that we became so used to as we were kind of growing up, I guess. The bits you can see on a Formula One car are the aerodynamic devices, and yet they're so restrictive that the tweaks and differences between one car to the next are so small that actually they're almost impossible to spot. Even for somebody like me who's looking out for these things and has an eye for that kind of detail, I find it very, very difficult to notice the difference. And if we painted all of the cars in exactly the same black finish, let's say, up and down the pit lane, I'd find it very difficult to pick out what every single one of those cars was without the livery and the stickers, just by the sort of silhouette of the aero. So if that's the case, why not free up some of those regs so that the bits that viewers can see can differentiate one car from the other and can inspire imagination so that kids might want to posters on their wall of an F1 car with something wacky, something crazy, some big active wing that sits on the back of the car, for example. Back in the day, there were six-wheeled cars. There were cars with a giant fan on the back. Things that were mind-blowing when you saw them for the first time. And those are the kinds of things that I look back on and think, that must have been so inspirational for kids or people wanting to breach into engineering as an industry, as a career. Those are the kind of things that inspire you to do that. So I'd love to see us get back to something like that. I'm really quite passionate about this, and I feel like particularly under the new cost cap regime, most of the regulations that are restrictive when it comes to design were restrictive, all for good reason back in the day, to keep costs from escalating so much, but we don't need to do that anymore because we've got a cost cap in place. So why not free up so many of those technical restrictions and let the teams decide how they want to spend the limited amount of money we're letting them spend each year. Right, let me see. Too much regulation means we end up with IndyCar. One chassis manufacturer, we want fan cars and the like, says Paul Charlton. Well, yeah, you know, it's what I sort of touched on there. It would be nice to see some differentiation. But just to sort of peg that back a little bit, the idea that we saw a fan car or six-wheel cars back in the day, that would be almost impossible to happen today, because that was people experimenting in the field. You know, there was no simulation. So nowadays, the experimentation would all be done in simulation, and by the time a car was actually produced and brought to a racetrack, most people would have converged on a very similar type of solution. We'd still get differences, but I don't think we'd get the kind of differences that we saw, like the fan car and the six-wheelers that I mentioned earlier on. So let's just temper that a little bit by saying that technology and simulation work has advanced so much that we wouldn't get people experimenting by building an experimental car. That build would be done in a virtual world, and only the one that proved to be best would ever make it to the racetrack. Is an F1 car hard to drive? Can a normal person drive it? So yes, a normal person can drive a Formula 1 car. We've seen many people do it. Listen, if Crofty can drive an F1 car, I mean, literally anybody can. The thing with a Formula 1 car is to actually make it move, to actually drive it around a track and change gear is incredibly straightforward. The hardest bit is pulling away, but to be honest, there are so many clever systems on a car now, like anti-stall, that would allow you to do that. And with very simple instruction, just getting the revs right and feeding the clutch in, you can pull the car away. And once you're moving, it's literally a case of clicking the gears up and down. You don't even use the clutch. So driving an F1 car is relatively simple. Of course, the bit that the F1 drivers do that very few others can do is drive it to the limit. And that is where their skill and expertise comes in. James Squire says the cost cap will just bring in ingenious accountants as well as engineers. I think you are right. There's going to be a real battleground in terms of finance over the next few years as this all settles down and people begin to uncover loopholes, try to then close those loopholes. Investing your time and money in a finance department, in top level accountants, is actually going to, or could have the potential to create a significant advantage for a team if they can find some kind of way around the restrictions of spending and be able to spend more money on making a car go more quickly. So I agree with you. Hammond spun lots. Yeah, Richard Hammond drove an F1 car. I have to say it wasn't a modern F1 car, and he did spin lots. And that's the thing, as soon as you start to push it, it is very easy to spin one of those cars. Just ask Nikita Mazepin. Let me see. Where are we going? Also, yeah, keeping the tyres in the window. Of course, once you start looking for the limit, it's the nuances around things like tyre temperature, something that most people driving an F1 car for a couple of laps on a demo run would never really have to worry about. It's when you get into the realms of competition and the limits is where you know, F1 drivers have the distinct advantage. Would the Mercs be able to easily make their rear wings more flexible for Baku? So a lot of people actually have asked me this over the course of this week on Instagram and Twitter and whatever. It's not actually that simple. The wing that Red Bull have on their car is the result of a long, I mean, many years of R&D. And it's not just a case of putting a clever joint on there or a clever device that openly allows it to flex. It's about the layup inside the carbon, the way that the fibres are weaved together inside the carbon fibre of the rear wing. It's about how they're constructed, the directions that those weaves are all laid in, the thickness of the weaves, the lattice nature of those weaves. There's a lot of science and research gone into how that layup is formed and how it will deform under certain loads. And given that the rear wing pullback test that happens in the pit lane, the static load test, is quite extreme. I said to you guys before, when you see it happening on your car during scrutineering, it's one of those wincing moments because they're pulling back on it so hard you think, oh my goodness, it's going to break. And yet, of course, the car on the racetrack at the very high speeds sees loads that are even greater than that. And it's that little zone there where the research and development into the layup of the fibres is all targeted. So just allowing it to flex in that little window of load that's greater than the static load test, but not going too far that the wing will break under the highest loads. So it's a fine science to do that. So not something that some other team could just copy in a moment. I mean, let's not make any mistake about this. I'm sure Mercedes have also been working on flexible aero components. I'm pretty sure all of the top teams have. It's just that, given that the load test, the FIA load test continually gets stricter and stricter year on year, Mercedes, I'm sure, have currently been pegged back by the load test, whereas Red Bull have continued to develop further and further, even though the potential gains are becoming smaller and smaller as the FIA load test gets greater and greater, the window of opportunity for flex becomes smaller. Red Bull have continued down that path and found an advantage, and there's a big part of me that has to take my hat off to them for that and say, well done. That is the type of marginal gains that help to win you championships. So we will have to see how it goes. Let me see. Will Ferrari bring the good pace to Baku? Prancing horse with good top speed. So potentially Ferrari can have a good weekend in Baku. The problem they will have is that top speed thing I still think is going to be their Achilles heel. As I said, Baku is a street circuit, but it's a really weird street circuit in that half the track is tight and twisty, lots of 90-degree corners, lots of stop-start, you know, a little bit Monaco-esque. And in those sections, we saw in Monaco how good they were. In terms of top speed, yes, they've been quick at times, but I think when it comes to having the amount of downforce that they need to get the braking traction and the grip through the slow section, having that top speed that they still want on the long straight is going to be perhaps something that might trip them up. So I could be wrong. I don't think that they're going to be anywhere near as quick as they were in Monaco, but look, they are showing signs of improvement, and that I think has got to be good for Formula One. Do you have any idea where Williams are weak at the moment and how to fix it, says Paul Charlton. I mean, I've only seen and heard the comments that you guys have. I have no inside line to Williams on that. I think that they have this, you know, they've called it a peaky car when it comes to downforce, and by that they mean the downforce is inconsistent. And my interpretation of that has always been that, you know, the attitude of the car, which is like the angle that the car sits, which has had a huge bearing on the aero performance, the downforce generation of any car. Of course, that attitude is constantly changing as the car rides curbs, as it goes over lumps and bumps. As it accelerates, there's the weight transfer towards the rear. As it brakes, there's weight transfer towards the front. That's constantly changing the attitude of the car. The cars that are very best, the Red Bulls of this world, the Mercedes of this world, are able to generate that max downforce, or the downforce they need, throughout the varying different angles of the attitude of the car, whether it's side to side through corners, whether it's front to rear. They put a huge amount of work into doing just that. It seems like the Williams perhaps doesn't have that. So it might have great performance under certain conditions, but if those conditions are not met, so if there are certain corner types where the weight transfers too far, or the corner type rolls the car too much, or the car's unsettled over a lump or a bump, for example, perhaps in that situation that car dumps all of its downforce in a kind of unexpected way for the driver, and that can be an incredibly difficult car to drive. It feels like that's some of their issue. Let me see. Might Lando Norris be as good or better as George Russell? Absolutely. Lando Norris is having a great time right now, isn't he? He's clearly a very good, talented driver. But what comes as the drivers get older, and certainly as they get more experience, that experience brings a huge amount to their game. And that's why Lewis Hamilton, after all these years, he was obviously always a talented driver, but now his experience is the thing that probably makes him the best driver on the grid right now. He's got experience of many years of Formula One, but he's also got experience of winning. He's got experience of all kinds of situations, all kinds of conditions, different car types, different racing scenarios that he's been in, strategic scenarios. That experience, like it does with anybody in any industry, gradually builds over time and just adds to what you can bring to the table. Lando Norris and George Russell are both building that, but the difficulty with George Russell is that his racing situations, his racing scenarios that he's faced over the few years that he's been in the sport have been pretty limited. He's been at the back almost all the time. He's not been racing wheel to wheel in the same way. He's not been in situations of extreme pressure like others have been when they're at the front, when they're challenging for podiums, when they've got cars all around them. And those differences, you know, George Russell may take longer to figure out, may take longer to build that into his skill set, whereas Lando Norris is finding that all the time right now. He's at the sharp end in the current situation he's in, and that will continue to add to his armoury of what he can bring to the table. So yes is the answer. He could be as good, he could be better, but I think it's very early days yet to judge either of them on the long term. They've both got a tremendous potential in this sport. Will McLaren be favourites in 22? Anybody who tells you that they have got somebody who they think are going to be favourites in 22 at this point is just dreaming. The only way I think that you can judge any pecking order for 22 is based on experience, in the way I've just been talking about from a team perspective. It's in terms of the facilities, the people they've got, and in those kind of scenarios you've got to be looking at the Mercedes, the Red Bull, yes, of course, McLaren, Ferrari. Those guys have a long history in the sport of dealing with multiple regulation changes. But in terms of who's going to be favourite when these cars, these radically different cars are produced, it's literally anybody's guess. History will play a very minimal role in what 2022 looks like in terms of performance spread, because some teams will get this right, others will get it wrong. Some will find loopholes, others will not. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the teams at the front that find those loopholes. We've seen with a Brawn, for example, that you can have a limited budget, you can have a limited set of experience, and yet find a loophole that can catapult you to the front. And when you've got such a vast array of changes in the cars, those loopholes, there definitely will be some. We're yet to find out what they are, but whoever finds them could have a distinct advantage. Is Alonso's return a flop? Well, again, I'd say early to judge it just yet. It's not been off to a good start, but then, you know, nor has Sebastian Vettel's move, nor has Daniel Ricciardo's move. I don't think we're necessarily saying that Daniel Ricciardo has suddenly become a terrible driver. I think what we're saying is they are taking time to settle into some pretty substantial changes, and those changes are even greater for Alonso, who's actually been out of the sport for a couple of years. So I think it's too early to write him off, but I'm sure that he will be as disappointed as any of his fans, because he will have been full of self-belief. He will have been expecting certainly to be more competitive against his teammate, let alone against the rest of the grid, and that hasn't happened. So yeah, for sure it looks like a flop. It looks disappointing at this point, and it is disappointing, but I think it's a bit early to write him or the team off just yet. What's your favourite F1 livery this year? I think the AlphaTauri I really like. Loved McLaren's livery for Monaco, of course, as most people did. But yeah, AlphaTauri I think is quite different. Other than that, you know what? In all the years I worked at McLaren, we had a few different liveries over the years. I thought the West livery was brilliant because it had lots of airbrushing, detailed design. It was a very distinctive look. The cars that were fast looked good. And that didn't matter what colour they were painted. If they were fast, they looked good. And that's typically the way people view F1 cars. A fast car is a good looking car, quite often. It's quite rare that a very good looking car, and there are exceptions to this, I'll definitely give you that, but it's unusual that a very slow car looks good, in my opinion. Alpine, for lots of people, Alpine saying they like the Alpine car. Yeah, I understand that. Let me see. Does Daniel struggle because of Renault to Merc switch? Well, it's everything, isn't it? It's just a car switch and a team switch and an environment switch, engineering switches. You know, it's everything. I think. I don't think it's just about the engine. I think it's way more than that. What about the Monaco race? Did you find it boring? Should it be scrapped? Well, we covered this last week. Yeah, of course, it wasn't the most exciting race day, but as a race weekend, I still love Monaco. I still think it has a lot to offer. Qualifying is often epic, and I don't think it should be scrapped. But we covered that in detail last year, so let's not go back over that. The Vodafone McLaren was the best for me, says Alan Stewart. Yeah, loved that car. The chrome one I thought was also a brilliant livery. But again, it was fast, so it looked good. Right. By the way, should we talk quickly about the Indy 500? And when I say we, I haven't seen it yet, but I'd love to know what you guys thought of it. I've seen on social just this afternoon, lots of people saying, you know, maybe they watched it for the first time and loved it. So I want to know, if you loved it, what did you love about it? Did you watch the whole thing? Do you find it boring that it's just going round in circles? You know, what was the experience like for you? Because I'm new to IndyCar, but I want to like it. I want to get into it and understand it. As many of you know, I was hoping to be there, and that, of course, didn't happen. So I want to know what you thought about this, because I'm interested in such a big sport in America, how huge it is. In fact, globally, how huge it is. Can F1 learn stuff from this, from IndyCar? You know, can IndyCar learn from F1? I saw the aero screen did its job over the course of this weekend as well for somebody. So, you know, what can we learn from IndyCar? What was good about it? What wasn't so good about it? Alexis V says, loved IndyCar, loved the quali. Okay, good. Yeah, you need to go to the Indy 500. I'm trying, believe me. Yeah, really good. I'd love to see F1 do an oval track just once a year. That's a good point. And I also think, as we talked about before, I'm well up for F1 trying different things. Maybe as a one-off, maybe as an experiment, but mixing up the F1 calendar, because whilst we all love F1, and I love it more than most, believe me, you know, I'd love to see it try and experiment and do some different stuff and see how it goes, how it comes out, you know. Jason Lovett says, I like the 500, but it's still too aero-dominant like F1. Okay, interesting. It's awesome to see those cars fast and sometimes 3 out of 4 on a row. Okay, yeah, so they race close. Do they still have the issue? Do they have an issue like F1 in terms of not being able to follow, or are we able to follow in IndyCar closely and have, do we get wheel-to-wheel racing? Love to know this sort of stuff. F1 to the Daytona track, yes, that would be very cool. I really like the IndyCar street circuits, but oval racing is not for me, says Alex Foley. TV direction could be better with giving information like in F1. So that's interesting. We touched on TV direction last week because Monaco was directed not by FOM, but by the ACM in Monaco. And the TV direction of the Monaco Grand Prix simply wasn't good enough. But I think it highlighted in that moment how good FOM and how good F1 typically is at the TV coverage. And I'm not talking about Sky or Channel 4 or Ziggo or anybody else that produces the show. I'm talking about the on-track action. F1 are typically very, very good at it, I think. So interesting that you didn't think that IndyCar was quite as good. So they can follow closely. That's good to hear. Josh Smith. Hi Josh, late to the party mate. Josh is normally here at about midday joining the chat. I didn't know you were going live today. I've only just joined. Have I missed much? Josh, you've missed loads mate, but you can catch up later. That's not a problem. We'll let you off this once. Welcome along. IndyCar is more boring than any Monaco race, says Chris Collins. Well, that's interesting, but why? Tell me why. Don't just say that. Why is it so boring? Chris Collins, come back to me. Tell me why it's boring. Is it just that they're going round and round in a circle? Is it because the racing itself is predictable? Is it something else? I want to know why. Push to pass, how does that work? Is it good? I'd love to know exactly those kind of details. Oval's a completely different animal. I have an appreciation for oval racing in that it's very different, and of course us being honed on what we are honed on with F1 as an F1 fan, you know, it's easy to look at that and say, well, they only turn left, it's all flat out high speed, you know, but it is much more than that. There is a huge amount of skill. Having sort of tried these things on a simulator, it's still a very fine line between putting it in the wall and getting the perfect lap, and it's not easy to do. It may not look as dramatic at times because we're not changing direction all in the same ways, but there is still a huge skill involved, and I guess from an appreciation point of view, that's one part that we might watch for. IndyCar's endurance. Josh Smith is so annoyed at himself. It's been on the bank holiday beers. That's fine, mate. Don't you worry about that. Right, where else? Marc sounds like a teacher now asking for an explanation. Yeah, show me your workings. Come on. By the way, just while we're on the subject of Monaco a moment ago, I said I'd mention this, and it could be something quite exciting coming up. I was lucky enough to be invited to the virtual paddock club for the Monaco Grand Prix weekend. I'd never done it before. It's something they introduced during, of course, last year when the actual paddock club wasn't able to happen for obvious reasons. So a virtual paddock club where VIP guests get a virtual login, and you can log into this stream, which is set up a couple of hours before the race starts. And you're essentially getting a similar kind of experience that you would be getting if you were at the track in the paddock club, minus the free champagne. And when I say free champagne, minus the champagne and canapes. But what you are getting is visits from some brilliant guests in the build-up to that race. And one of the things I loved about it was, of course, it was a celebration for Williams. It was heavily Williams focused because of their 750th anniversary, race anniversary, not anniversary, but race celebration. They had Jamie Chadwick come in and give a talk, which was really fascinating. They had George Russell come and give a chat, which was brilliant. Pat Simmons came along, not just Williams specific, but Pat Simmons came along to talk about F1 and the future of F1. We had some amazing guests, as well as some VTs that have been put together around various things about the track guides. We had Sean Kelly, the virtual stat man, come on and rattle off some amazing stats around that particular race. So it was something that I thought was really interesting. I was very lucky to have that experience. And so I went back to the people at the virtual paddock club and said, listen, that was amazing. Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it. And what they have suggested to me, and I'm not even sure I should be saying this, so keep it to yourself because it might not happen yet, but there is a chance I might be able to get some virtual paddock club passes to give to you lot. I was hoping to do it for the Baku Grand Prix this weekend, but I haven't been able to sort it out in time. So fingers crossed, at a race coming up very soon, I might be able to get some of you entrance, virtually, of course, to the paddock club for whichever Grand Prix it happens to fall on. And if it does come your way, I absolutely encourage you to go for it because it was just something that was unique. It was something very different. I had it on, just sat on my laptop, of course. I had the TV coverage in the background. I had all my usual screens, but this was another added element. And I actually thought it was fascinating. So that's just something that I thought I'd drop in. I'm going to find out a lot more details, and maybe next week I will come back to you. Certainly keep an eye on my socials because I will definitely shout it out on there if I get that opportunity. But as I say, keep it to yourself. I haven't got it sorted yet. Right, so yes, I gather, yeah, you'd all love to see that. That'd be great. I know you would, and I would love to be able to give it to you. So keep those fingers crossed. Right, let me see. A wheel would not fit between the holes in the halo. F1 does not need an aero screen. Well, in that scenario, perhaps not, but there are many other objects that would fit between the hole of the halo, as we've seen in the past. That can definitely happen. So, I mean, what do you think? Aero screen. Essentially, the aero screen kind of has a halo behind it, but it also has that plexiglass screen in front of it to give an added layer of protection. I do wonder how that works when it comes to things like rain or oil on the screen from another car. Maybe you know, I don't know, I haven't looked into it enough, but it's something that IndyCar have chosen to use that scenario, that solution. F1, of course, used the simple halo device, both of which have already proven that they can save lives. So whichever way, you know, sports go, I think it's great that those things are now in the sport. Craig Susag says, Indy is not boring. I love the strategies. They're fascinating. See, for me, I'd agree with you. I'd love to get into that. I don't know enough about the strategies yet, but it's something that's I definitely want to uncover more of. And I am going to over the course of the next months and year, ahead of next year's Indy 500, which I still hope I might be able to get to. I would love to understand a lot more about what I'm watching. Right, where should we go next? What should we talk about next? Chris Collins, here we go, he's back, here you go. It's just not technically and data analytics enough for me. Well, thanks, Chris. I appreciate you coming back with an explanation. Well done. You don't need to come and see me in my office now. Thanks for showing you're working. So it's not technically and data analytics enough for you. Okay, well, that's fair enough. I mean, I think that's actually a criticism that's been levelled at IndyCar as opposed to F1 a number of times in the past. F1 is an incredibly technologically advanced sport, not just the cars, but the sport. Everything that goes on behind the scenes is massively technologically advanced. And IndyCar is in many areas, but I don't think it's quite as refined, it's technologically refined as F1 is. And look, maybe those Indy fans out there would disagree with me, and I will happily be proven wrong. But that, I think, as same as you, Chris, that would be my perception from the outside, is that F1 is a bit more cutting edge, refined technology than perhaps IndyCar is. Brian Anderson says, hey Mark, it's my first live chat from SoCal. Hey Brian, thanks very much for joining. Welcome along. Everybody always welcome. Right, Kevin Worrell says, where can Russell go next year? I don't think Mercedes want him next year, and there's no other half decent drives, maybe Renault. Let's talk about that. Good point, Kevin, and that is a real dilemma, I think. Not just a dilemma for George Russell, potentially a dilemma for Mercedes. We've already seen Esteban Ocon in a similar situation where Mercedes weren't ready for him. He was the sort of protege a few years ago and found himself on the sidelines for a year. He's now come back to Renault and is, let's face it, doing a pretty decent job for them at the moment. What could George Russell do? And the answer is that there is no brilliant solution in that scenario, because if he stays at Williams, he's still at the back of the grid. Yes, he stays on the grid, but he's at the back of the grid. And for the reasons that I mentioned earlier on, that only has a limited amount of appeal, not just in terms of he wants results, he wants to be able to show what he can do, but in terms of growing him as an F1 driver, there's limited options or limited possibilities for how far he can go as an F1 driver whilst always at the back. If Mercedes decide they want to stick with Valtteri Bottas and Lewis Hamilton for another year, another 2 years, whatever it might be, where do they put George Russell? Or does George Russell say, right, thank you, but I'm going to break away from Mercedes and try and go this alone, at which point potentially Renault becomes an option for him. But is it a good option? It's an option that, as it stands, would move him slightly further up the grid. But as I said earlier on, from next year onwards, there's no guarantees that the current grid order will be the same. And I suppose you could also throw that back at Williams and say, well, there's a possibility Williams could find themselves higher up the order anyway. And if George Russell were to stay there, maybe he could benefit off the back of that. But the problem is, before these contracts, or by the time these contracts all have to be signed and sealed for next year, and most of them already are, but those that have to be settled before next year, they have to be settled before anyone has any real pecking order picture in mind of who's done a good job or not. It's going to be done, those deals are going to be done on promises and predictions, and you know they can go either way. So it's a real difficult one. So in answer to your question, Kevin, I don't know the answer. Does anybody? Let me see. Marc don't want Williams can be midfield in 22. Well, they could be, says Varun Sambi, or they could be right at the back. Who knows? That's exactly what I'm talking about. It's just a big unknown at this point. It would be awful if George waits all this time for Marc, only for them to be midfield or just not so fast after the big rule change, says Alex Whitehead. So that's a good point. So let's say George Russell was called into the main Mercedes team, and yet, you know, they weren't as dominant as they were this year. The reason that's unlikely, or less likely than it might be for another team, is that the reason Mercedes have been so successful over the past few years, one is they have a huge budget, massive budget, only matched perhaps by Ferrari, maybe at times Red Bull, but an enormous budget. Well, that's gone. That advantage has now gone. Now they are at the budget cap along with the other top half of the grid, or the top teams. So that advantage is gone. But that's not the only reason they've been successful. Ferrari have had a comparable budget and have actually been a long way off their performance levels. So one of the other big reasons Mercedes have been successful is they've got a great team of people, a great factory with some amazing resource and facilities already installed in it. They have got an incredible culture within that team. The working environment is one that clearly yields results year after year. They've got a great engine, power unit. That will continue for next year as well. So there are a lot of things that you would say, as somebody mentioned earlier on, who's the favourite for 2022, very difficult to say, but if you were going to try and pick favourites, you would probably pick from one of those people like a Red Bull or like a Mercedes because of what they've built up until this point. That in theory, and it is just in theory, should stand them in good stead for adapting to new rules, for dealing with a changing environment. And even if they don't get it right first time, being able to adapt to that change and find a way to bring it back on track. Something that another team that might be struggling in that department might not have the same capability to do. That's my take on it. There's a lot of talk of a Bottas replacement. Where there's smoke, there is fire. Well, there's been talk of a Bottas replacement for years. There is often smoke where there's fire, and I would not rule that out. And it will very much, I'm sure, depend on some results over the next few races. And as I've talked about before, there is a possibility that Mercedes are starting to think that whilst Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas have been the perfect pairing up until now, that's partly because they've not had a close rival from outside of their own team. Now, if Valtteri Bottas is not coming second behind Lewis Hamilton, or if the two drivers are not coming first and second, well then you've got to say you've now got a deficit. You've got one of those drivers, if it's Valtteri who's coming behind a Max Verstappen, let's say, you're not getting maximum points for your team. So could another driver, could a George Russell potentially get that? But that might come with some added complications around team dynamics. So it's a very difficult thing to get right. Josh Smith, who's woken up now, isn't he? Here he goes. He thinks Mercedes should have Russell in next year. Well, I think that, I think George Russell deserves a place at the top of the tree. We know he's quick. We know he's good enough, or potentially good enough. But it's much more complicated than that in terms of the team dynamic. What is Lewis Hamilton going to do? How long is Lewis Hamilton going to do it for? There are so many questions around Mercedes that are not simply about is it Valtteri or is it George Russell? Russell to go to Red Bull next year. Well, that's another very decent possibility, to be honest with you. If he were to decide, if he wasn't taken up by Mercedes and decided to leave the program, it's a brave move to walk into the Red Bull driver program voluntarily. Yes, Sergio Perez has done that this year, but of course it was a lifeline for him. He was at the very end of his career. George Russell, a guy that's still quite early in his career, potentially, that's a difficult thing to do, to walk into a Red Bull program that has churned out so many drivers over so many years and go up against the Max Verstappen. Difficult one. Who says Williams won't be nearer the top next year? Well, exactly. That's we touched on that earlier, says Michael Hellbrow. Absolutely, they could well leap up the grid just through doing a better job of the 22 regulations. Absolutely. But George Russell and Williams will have to make a decision on George's future long before we know the answer to that. Does a driver have to be a certain weight and height? So no is the answer today, and George Russell is a good example of that. He's incredibly tall. There are advantages to being short as a racing driver. There used to be advantages to being lightweight as a racing driver, although I'm sure most of you know this now. There's now a minimum weight for the driver, including the seat. And that was done to stop drivers having to go on these extreme fasting diets to lose weight, because if a driver's underweight, then the seat has to be ballasted up to meet the minimum weight regulations for driver and seat combined for exactly that reason. So unless you are extremely heavy, at which point there would be a disadvantage, but you're very unlikely to become an F1 driver being extremely heavy, then your weight is much less influential than it used to be. Your height, though, can have an impact. It can have an aero impact, as well as just fitting you into the actual cockpit. George Russell, we know, struggled to fit into the Mercedes car because it wasn't necessarily designed for him. And so with a George Russell or somebody like an Esteban Ocon, you have to take that height into consideration, where the pedal box sits and all the other components that are around that all have an impact in chassis design. But also on top of that, a taller driver typically will sit higher up. Their helmet will sit higher up towards the airbox and will influence the airflow differently, both into the airbox and around the airbox and on towards the rear wing, than a driver that sits slightly lower in the car. So that can all, and it only has to be by a very small amount to impact the aerodynamics of the car in a slightly different way to a shorter driver. So yes, that can have a difference. There is no absolute rules to say you've got to be this tall or short or this heavy or light, but they can have an impact. How come Mercedes allow Lewis to do all these extreme activities mid-season? Well, the reason they do that, and this is, I'm sure you've all seen Lewis Hamilton jumping out of a plane skydiving recently. The reason Mercedes allow him to do that is because that's how you get the best out of a Lewis Hamilton, by allowing him to live his life. It's the very reason, or one of the very reasons, that he left McLaren. A very restrictive environment under Ron Dennis back then for a young driver like Lewis, and he wanted to have a little bit more freedom. And look, everybody's different. Some people work very well in a restrictive environment where they have a very strictly regulated framework around them in which to operate. And if that works for them, then great. But others need the freedom to let their hair down post-race, to go and, Kimi's another one, loved to party. Not so much today, but he loved to party back in the day. He loved to let his hair down and have a release after the pressure of a race weekend. If your working environment doesn't allow somebody to do that, then they don't ever release that pressure. They have to find different ways, and it builds up. And at some point, you start to lose the performance because that driver or that individual is not happy in their work. They're not feeling free and empowered and relaxed when they come to do their job. They're not able to focus in the same way. And we're talking about human performance at an elite level here, whether it's drivers or mechanics or engineers or whatever, pit stop crew. These are elite level individuals, and you have to find ways to allow them to operate at their very best. I've done episodes of my podcast on this very subject. Go check it out. Pit Lane Life Lessons in any of the podcast stores. There's a heavy plug. Series 2 coming very soon, by the way. Working on it at the moment. Right, how long we got left? 8 minutes. Why doesn't Lewis Hamilton do track walks or use the sim? Because, this is Craig O'Brien says that, because he doesn't feel that gives him an advantage. I mean, to be fair, not all drivers do those things. Lewis Hamilton has raced on almost every track there is going. So in terms of a track walk, maybe he doesn't feel he needs that anymore. And maybe he feels in the opening lap or laps of free practice, he can learn enough about the track to build into his own data banks of what he needs to know about that racetrack, and doesn't need to spend time going to walk the track. Similarly on the simulator. The simulator is very useful. We talked about this before. For the teams, it's less useful for the drivers. Some drivers, though, feel a lot more comfortable having bashed in laps after laps in the virtual world, whereas others don't feel it's a close enough experience, and actually it might detract because all this knowledge you've built up in the virtual world, if there are some slight differences when you get into the real car, you've then got to adapt from what you've been conditioned to expect as you go around the lap from the sim. So it works for some people, it doesn't work for others, and it's not just Lewis that doesn't do those things. Almost beer o'clock, says BB King, thank you, and I am definitely having a beer tonight. Can't wait for that. Does Perez have a qualifying problem? 5 races in and only 2 good Saturdays. Well, yes, he does, is the bottom line of that right now. He has an issue in getting the very best out of that car over a single lap, which is what you need to do, of course, in qualifying. In the race, he seems much stronger. But in the race, you're not operating at the very highest limit over 1 lap. That's what you've got to do in qualifying. And what he seems to be struggling with is taming that Red Bull, getting it under control whilst operating right at the very limit. And it's something that's a very difficult question to answer as to why that is, because we've seen so many drivers not be able to operate in the same way that Max Verstappen can at the limit of that Red Bull's performance, year on year on year. Only the people looking at the data can have some clearer insight into that. But it's still something that, you know, even I'm baffled at. I've seen many drivers over the years struggle in similar ways. You know, you can show somebody a sheet of data to say, look, this is what your teammate's doing. He's braking, you know, 5 meters earlier into this corner, and, you know, he's carrying a little bit less speed through, but he's getting a better exit. So you go and do that, right? You think it's that simple, but it isn't, because you're talking about 5 meters earlier braking when you're coming down from 200 miles an hour. And that is not just about the mechanics of hitting the pedal at the right time. It's about trusting your instincts. It's about how that weight transfers onto the front axle, and then what feeling you get through the steering wheel when you turn it in. Have you got the confidence to be able to rely on the car doing what you need it to do if you were to brake 5 meters earlier or later? And most of that is psychological, as well as understanding what physically what you need to do with your inputs, your driver control inputs, to get something different out of the car, which might go against everything that you have grown up doing or that you have built into your repertoire as a driver. And, you know, your driving style is something that is acquired over time, and of course you have to adapt it and evolve it all the time. But if you come up against a car that requires something that seems so significantly different, that's not an easy thing to just adapt to. And I'm sure that's on a similar level for Daniel Ricciardo, for, you know, Sebastian Vettel and others that are having to adapt to new cars. It's just that seemingly that Red Bull has perhaps some more extremely different traits than some of the other cars, because we've seen lots of drivers have these same issues over time. Kevin Worrell, I hope the Red Bull's rear wing gets banned before Baku. I'm guessing you're a Mercedes fan. We've covered that one in depth. Either Red Bull is too fine-tuned to Max, or Max is just that good. Well, I think Max is obviously very good, but, you know, if I talk about your experience and your driving style as something that builds over time, Max's driving style has built over time. I've just lost my light. Max's driving style has built over time in that Red Bull. And so it's always been tuned to the car. The car's always been tuned to him. So, you know, that's why he's so comfortable and the car works so perfectly with his driving style. I'm not saying it's just that Red Bull design everything around Max, but they've been part of the family together for a long, long time. So it's natural that it would evolve in that way. And others that are coming in, only given a short period of time to perform, don't have the same opportunity that Max has had to grow with the car. And I also know that Max obviously won his first race in a Red Bull. So, you know, I'm not saying that I'm not taking anything away from Max there. Max is a very, very talented driver, one of the very best. But it's also a little bit more than that when it comes to other drivers trying to emulate him in the same car. Hooray, a technical issue, says Josh. Yeah, we had to have one, didn't we? Yes, one of my little lights has just died, but you can still just about see me. Right, let's see. We've got a minute to go. Russell has said he's happy to stay at Williams and gain more experience than push Bottas. Well, he is going to say that because what he can't do is tell Williams he definitely wants to leave and then have no option to go to, because no team wants a driver who doesn't want to be there. So I think that's probably what you would say. What made you choose a green ceiling? I haven't got a green ceiling. It's grey. And I didn't choose it, as you can imagine. It was Mrs. P. Max won because the Mercedes crashed. No, don't. I mean, yes, that was a big part of it, but he also did a very, very good job on his debut. Thank you for sacrificing your bank holiday evening for us, Mark. No problem at all. Thank you for joining. You've all joined as well. So look, let's wind it up. It is 10 o'clock and I am going to get a beer. But look, I appreciate you all coming back. I know that I was very late in announcing this show this evening, but that's because I literally only got back 45 minutes before it started. I'm pleased that we were able to do it. I'm pleased so many of you came along. Do hit the like button if you'd be so kind. I'd really appreciate that. And I will follow me or just keep an eye on my socials because over the course of this week, if there's any way I can get hold of some of those virtual Paddock Club tickets, either for Baku or more likely for a future race, you will be the first to know. I would love for some of you to get your hands on them, because I do think it was something really, really unique and worth experiencing if you can. So thank you very much, everybody. We shall leave it there. Have a wonderful week, and I will catch up with you very, very soon. Ta-ra, folks.